Hi, John here, the hat guy. It's a pretty crazy world we're living in right now. A lot of things have changed in the last few weeks. If you've been listening to this channel, about a month ago, I gave you my views of what would happen if the church, all of the Christians, were raptured out of the earth right now. If basically all the Christians are suddenly gone, what would happen? I talked a lot about Bible prophecy and what are known as end-time events. And based on what the Bible tells us about these end-time events, we can make some predictions about what is going to happen at the end times, the time of the end. And the big question is that where we are right now? I believe we are. I've believed we have been at this point for a long time. The question is, how far along the scale are we? Are we ready to turn the next page and begin all of the events that happen in end-time prophecy in the Bible? Or are we going through a dry run, so to speak, of on a political nature just to get everything lined up and ready for when those events happened? Could be either one of those things. Could be none of them. End times could still be hundreds or more years in the future. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that's where we are now. The point is, the Bible tells us we don't know. But we're given the Bible to give us a clue, the signs. It says, look for the signs and the seasons. And the signs and the seasons point to right now. So, based on that assumption that we are living in the early stages of the end time events, what do I think is going to happen based on my understanding of prophecy? Okay, well, what would have to happen is the world would have to come together as a one world government. And the Bible says that the person that leads this government, this one world government, will be overwhelmingly popular across the whole world. Now, it's also fairly clear that he is not the one that forms the government. This government will be formed and put in place, and then this man will be put in there. The Bible calls him the Antichrist. But the point is, it would have to be a one world government. Well, what is a government? The Bible also says it will be made up of 10 kingdoms, but these 10 kingdoms will not have any power. Well, that's an interesting phrase. Now, the terminology is open to interpretation simply because it was written 2,000 years ago. And the term president and Congress weren't largely known or had great meaning. Granted, Rome had a Congress, but that was about it. Most people understood a country to be a kingdom, and the word kingdom means country. It also specifically means a monarchy, but it can be interpreted as any type of country. So that point being made, what are these 10 kingdoms that make up this one world government, and how do we get there from a world that has roughly 200 countries in it? It's a good question. One of the things you would have to do is cause some kind of worldwide cataclysmic event that would cause everybody in every country to panic and to have a crisis that their specific individual countries cannot handle. This COVID-19 virus could be the key. Whether it's as deadly as they would like us to believe, I don't know. In my mind, the numbers still don't add up. But the point is, the world believes it and are acting in accordance with that. So whether or not it is as deadly as they're saying is irrelevant at this point. The point is, the entire world is shut down. We're all on basically house arrest, for want of a better term. We're not allowed to go anywhere. We're not allowed to do anything. We're not allowed to leave our homes unless it's an absolute emergency. And in some states and in some countries, that's being enforced by the police. There was a church here in Florida. It was over in Tampa this past weekend. One of the bigger churches The pastor refused to shut his church down. He held services and he packed the house out twice that day. Police came in and arrested him because there were more than 10 people there. He violated the rule of the day. I've talked on here before about how that's a violation of our First Amendment rights, and it is. Is it necessary? Maybe. I don't know. Point is, it's a violation. And the Constitution is specific and very clear that you cannot prohibit somebody from doing that. Whether it's a good idea or not isn't taken into account. The point is, you can't prohibit them, and they did. I think it was either the governor of New York or the mayor of New York City. I believe it was the governor in New York made the statement that if any church refuses to comply by not closing down, then when this is all over, they will not be allowed to continue. That's in direct violation of the First Amendment. We can go on and on about that. Certain states, Maryland, one of them, they're going to start enforcing it with police action. If you leave your house for any reason and you don't have papers to show, proving that you should be there, well, that reeks of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And it's, at any rate, I'm going down a rabbit hole here. The point is, what would happen next? What, according to prophecy, what needs to happen? Well, a world government needs to be formed. Well, the UN was formed at the end of right after World War II, and it's a governing body. At the moment, it doesn't have any power. It's not really ever had power, but it is recognized across the world universally as a governing power, and it's a group made up of all of the different nations. Okay, well, that's a lot of nations. Where's this 10 kingdom idea come from? Well, the UN has the world divided into 10 regions for response to emergencies. These regions could be interpreted by someone writing this down 2,000 years ago as kingdoms without power. It makes sense from a biblical standpoint. So, from my understanding of end-time prophecies, the UN will at some point take control, and it will divide the world into the 10 regions that it already has lined up, and that will be the one world government. The end-time prophecies also talk about a one world religion. Well, a few years ago, that would have been pretty hard to imagine. Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Hindus and all of the other myriad of religions out there all melding into one religion. It's pretty hard to swallow. As a Christian, I can't see that ever happening with myself and people who believe like I do. But end-time prophecy also says that at some point the church will be removed, meaning all of those of us who are Christians and who profess Jesus Christ as our Savior, we will be taken out of the world, and we will not be here at some point during all of this. And my understanding is it'll be fairly early in the process. So when this one world religion is formed, it will be made up of people, a lot of whom will call themselves Christians, but who aren't in the biblical sense. Now, having said that, there's some interesting things happening. Fairly recently, last year, I believe, and the year before, the Pope of the Catholic Church in Rome has met with one of the high-ranking Muslim imams, I believe they're called, and they've been in talks for a long time. In fact, they sat down and signed an agreement to basically a non-violence agreement to get along and to, it's the first steps of forming this religion. There's been several things that happened. I read an article recently that was from 1986 where the leaders of 12 different major religions in the world had gotten together to try to work out their differences. So the groundwork is in place for all of this to happen. So what will happen politically? We set religion aside and set Christianity aside, and I don't mean set it aside. I mean the Christians will be removed from the equation, but if you're just focused on today, I'm sitting here in this lockdown and I don't know what's going to happen. I can't work and the government's giving me one check, but what happens, the month after that? And you got a lot of questions and concerns, and they're well-founded. We increased the federal budget by 50% just to write those checks that we've yet to receive. And that's clearly unsustainable. We're not in a situation where we can continue this lockdown for any length of time without catastrophe, major catastrophe happening. That's where we are right now. So what's going to happen then, according to my understanding of prophecy? Well, my understanding of prophecy, the events and what I see going on is the president is only loosely in control, because there's so many other factors. Our government is very complex. In today's world, most governments have to be complex in order to function. So you've got the president wanting to do a certain thing. He made the statement that he wanted the economy back going by Easter. Well, that's 2 weeks away. Then recently they talked him into changing his mind and pushed it back to the end of April. Okay, well, there's some states, the state of Virginia, for example, has put their people on absolute lockdown until June the 10th, which is a fascinating day because the Republican primary is June the 9th. Can't imagine a Democratic governor would factor that into his equation. But I digress. At any rate, the point is, sometime between the end of April and the middle of June, all of the states in this country have laid down the rules that you have to shelter in place or be locked down. Here in Florida, we're not prohibited from going outside just yet. Some states they are. They're getting to the point where they don't want you to even open your door and walk out of it. And that's to be expected. What happens next? Well, at some point, a form of martial law will be put into place. Now, whether they call it that or not is irrelevant, but we're not far from that now. And what that will mean is we'll have police patrolling the streets looking for anybody who is outside, and that whoever is outside will be confronted. And if that person doesn't have an immediate specific reason and can prove that he has that reason to be there doing what he's doing, then he will be arrested. That's not the America that I grew up in. It's certainly not the America that I read about in history books. But that's the next step for our current version of America. Now, do I think the president wants that? No, he does. He clearly doesn't. But like I said, there's so many other factors involved. Everything has been politicized in this world today, especially in this country. Even the most minor thing has been politicized for manipulation, primarily by those on the left. But to fight that, everyone on the right has to do the same thing. So it's a problem that grows exponentially. And when you put this COVID-19 crisis or scare into the mix, it becomes catastrophic. So what do I think will happen? What I think will happen is at some point martial law will be declared. When martial law is declared, police will start patrolling, like I just said, and arresting people. And as this prolongs and as this progresses, and if we get into May and June and we're still on lockdown, small businesses will have pretty much lost their business by now. A lot of them already have irreparably lost their businesses. Jobs will be gone. People will be destitute and at some point start being put out of their houses. Then what happens? You're put out because you can't pay the rent because you have no money, and then the government arrests you because you're outside and you're not supposed to be. It's a vicious cycle. There's a monument in Georgia that has a pretty shady and sketchy history. Nobody truly knows how it got there or why it's there. It's called the Georgia Guidestones. They're in northwest Georgia. They have a statement on them written in an abundance of languages. And the statement is a guide on how to create this utopia of a new world order that these people want. One of the things on that list, and the interesting thing about that list is we seem to be following that. So whoever is behind the scenes pulling the strings seems to be following that agenda. The people with the true power are people we never see or even hear of. There are people out there doing that. They control the people that we see. Yes. Is that a conspiracy theory? Absolutely. Do I believe it's real? Yes, I do. A lot of the things that happen in the world today, especially in this last month, can only be explained by that. Having said that, what does this guide say? One of the things that it says, and the one that is probably the most disturbing, is that it says that the population of the world needs to be maintained at about 500 million. Okay? Without thinking at all, that says, all right, well, that's, we have to have an upper limit because the world can only feed so much of us. Well, that's true and that isn't true. But right now, we've got more than 7 billion people on this planet. And if you're going to maintain a world population of 500 million, that means 6.5 billion people have to die. That is a frightening thought. Maybe this is a weaponized virus that came out of China. Maybe other people are involved in its manufacture. There's some rumors that Obama was involved. There's rumors that Clintons were involved. There's rumors that Bill Gates was involved. I don't know. I don't really care. The point is, it's there and it's being used. If that's their goal, then that's a pretty frightening thought. But if the goal is merely world domination, then the numbers may or may not be relevant. I don't know. Right now, it doesn't seem as if as many people are dying as what they're saying, although the new numbers that they're predicting now is that it's going to be a minimum of 100,000 people, maybe 200,000 people in this country die from this virus. Okay, those are some pretty scary numbers. I don't know. None of us know what's going to happen. But at some point, the UN, in my belief, will step in around the world, because especially a lot of the poorer countries in the world, they can't afford to be locked down like this. Some countries, I lived in the Bahamas for 4 years as an American civilian contractor on a Navy base over there. And it's a poor country. It relies almost exclusively on tourism. And with tourism gone, they've got no revenue at all. They have very little industry. They have some, but very little. And granted, most of the people, it isn't a country made up of 700 islands, so most of the people can fish for food, so they're probably not going to starve. But they will rapidly revert back into a primitive society if this is prolonged for many months or years. And most of the world will as well. It's a scary proposition. So at some point, the UN will see all of this, and they will step in, and they will start probably with some of these poorer countries. And the Bahamas is not at the bottom of that list. There's a whole lot of countries out there that are much, much poorer in far worse condition, and that are probably already hurting. And the UN at some point will step in and start helping those countries. And eventually, they will help everybody, and they will take over. That's my belief. That's where I think we're headed. It's how we get there, I don't know. One of the things I would see happening is perhaps the country will start to split apart again. We've tried that before. 100 and some years ago, back in the early 1860s, several states seceded from the Union. And the federal government didn't like that, so war ensued, and they brought them back in forcefully. You can argue whether or not it was legal for them to do so. I believe it was. But the point is, they did. They tried it, and they failed. I think it'll be tried again. There's already some interesting signs pointing towards that happening. For example, the state of Florida, where I live, several days over this past weekend, in fact, put roadblocks up on the interstate highways leading into the state. It would be I-10 over at the Alabama border and I-95 on the Florida-Georgia border. And I haven't heard about 75 yet. I'm assuming they're there as well. But I've talked, I have accounts from people who have come through the border on I-10 and the border here closer to me, north of Jacksonville, was in the news. There was a lot of pictures even showing what was going on there. Basically, their whole premise is that they don't want to allow anybody into the state who is from New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut. And that if they do come in, they have to self-isolate for 14 days. And they're demanded to tell them where they're going to be staying, who they're going to be staying with, and contact information. Well, you fast forward to Tuesday, which was yesterday, and as of 5 o'clock Tuesday evening, March 31st, the state of Florida has said that no hotels can rent to anybody who is not a necessary person to be there. In other words, zero tourism. So if you're just driving into Florida because you want to escape, because right now New York seems to be the epicenter, at least in North America, of what's going on with this virus. And yeah, you got 10 million people all packed into a pretty small area. It's hard to stay 10 feet away from people, or 6 feet, or whatever the number is. You simply can't do that. So naturally, it's going to explode, and it did. And a lot of the people are trying to escape. A lot of them have friends and relatives in Florida. Some of them have summer homes down here, or winter homes rather. And so they're trying to get down here to them. And the state of Florida is going out of their way trying to avoid that from happening. And I can see why they would want to. Whether it's legal or not is irrelevant. The point is it's happening. And what's the next step? The next step is they close the border entirely. I would be shocked if Florida is the only state doing this. Wouldn't surprise me to see other states doing it. There's what could happen to form the UN taking control? Well, certain things have to happen. One of which is the United States would have to lose all interest in anything outside of itself. And in my lifetime, that's never happened. It would have to get to, with our crisis internally, would have to get to the point that we don't care what happens into the rest of the world. We're having enough problem focusing on ourselves, and a new civil war would probably form that. My views, it would be different than what it was 150 years ago, because it's a different world than it was. I think the states would start seceding, and they wouldn't be just in a group like, well, all of the South succeeded and tried to form a new country. No, I think each state would do its own thing. The state of Florida, for example, just to use it as a good example, there are several military bases scattered around the state. Florida has a lot of farmland. It has a fairly large population, has a pretty decent infrastructure. They could probably stand on their own fairly decently. Several other states could do the same thing. Some states would struggle and would try to form alliances, and you would see some of that popping up. How would I see it break up? I could see Florida being its own state. I could see Texas certainly being its own state, and Alaska and Hawaii. I could see some of New England moving over to Canada. I could see maybe Idaho and Montana joining forces. I could see probably Washington, at least part of Washington State, and Oregon, and maybe Northern California joining up together to do something. The rest of California would probably do their own thing. Most of the Midwest would probably form some sort of pact or confederation to stay together. But the point is, once all this starts happening, then the United States will lose its world power and its world status. Some states, California, for example, has the 10th largest economy in the world if it was its own country. Okay, that's a pretty powerful country all by itself, but it's got a lot of problems and issues. And they would probably form a communist government that would rapidly deteriorate into something like Venezuela, simply because of the attitudes and ideas that they have there. Florida and Texas would probably be okay, but they wouldn't have the strength that all 50 states have as one combined whole. So there are some advantages that it would be. There would be a lot more disadvantages to breaking up the Union. I can argue that point pretty comfortably on both sides. So yeah, I can see a lot of things. Personally, I think some things would be better, but I think a whole lot of things would be worse, especially when it comes to our status as a world power, because it would be gone. That would leave the other two existing world powers, or powers that want to be world powers. That would be China and Russia. Russia is probably going to have their own problems in a similar fashion if this progresses. The one country that wouldn't would be China. China has a pretty firm control over their people, and I don't know. I don't see China breaking up, and that's would leave them as a sole world power. I don't know. So they would probably be in opposition to this world government unless they put their people in charge of it. And so I don't know. Beyond that point, it becomes murky to me. But at some point it will become irrelevant, because the Antichrist will be put in charge, and the Bible will start playing out right before everyone's eyes with some of the more frightening aspects of the book of Revelation. But those are my opinions on what could happen. What could also happen is either some cure is found, or some vaccine is found, or something happens to stop all of this madness and we go back to work. And if that happens sometime over the course of the next 30 days or maybe 6 weeks, then probably everything will be fine, and we'll come back probably a lot stronger than we ever were, just like the president is predicting. But if it progresses beyond that point, at some point there will be a point of no return. I don't think we've reached it yet, but it's not very far in the future. And if this lockdown continues for 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, before we get to the 6-month point, we will be at the scenario I just described. Pretty grim, yes. What's another option? Another option would be that at some point the lockdown continues and the government just collapses, and maybe the UN doesn't step in. And then what do you have? You have some sort of Mad Max-like scenario happening around the world where it's just anarchy, and a whole lot of people would die. Most people in most cities would probably die, because if the society were to crumble completely, those of us who live in cities, and I live in a city where this general area has 1.5 million people, you can't survive off of a hunter-gatherer kind of mindset very long with 1.5 million people surviving. And it's, it would be truly one of those, only the fittest can survive, the people with the skills and the knowledge to go out and hunt for food. And I spent a lot of time in West Virginia. I grew up in Western Maryland. All of that is very rural, mountainous country full of people that know how to hunt. And I'm not opposed to going out and hunting, believe me. But if I'm going to do that from Jacksonville, Florida, with 1.5 million other people trying to do the same thing, there's a pretty good chance that a lot of us would die in the crossfire. I'm a big guy. I've got some age on me. I'm not very quick on my feet. And I'm nearsighted. So, I'm a fairly good shot when it comes to it. But, somebody half my age would probably, have a slight advantage over me. So, I don't know. That's another scenario. I don't think that one will happen. I would give it, maybe a 10% chance of happening. I would give us recovering from this a 40% chance of happening. And I would give the UN taking control a 60% chance of happening. That's my take on it. These are just my opinions. I could be wrong, and I hope and pray that I am. But I'm John. I'm the Hat Guy. Have a great day.